So we left off with our first three sections for our apology for the divinity of Jesus Christ. We looked at the historical reliability, basically the basic category being the trustworthiness of the New Testament Gospels. We looked at the evidence from the manuscript reliability, as well as the evidence from the historical reliability. I gave you 6 reasons why we can conclude reasonably and responsibly that the authors of the Gospels are accurately telling us what Jesus said and did. Then we looked at the historical claims of Jesus to divinity. We looked at some examples that are explicit in your face, meriting the charge of blasphemy. And we looked at some implicit claims as well. Even in the implicit claim, it merited blasphemy, so we might even put that under the category of explicit. And then we asked the question, should we believe the claims of Jesus to divinity? And I think we can reasonably conclude, yes, that he is who he says he is. The alternatives do not make sense. It is not reasonable to conclude he is a liar or that he is a lunatic, but that he is indeed Lord. In our final section for tonight, as I mentioned before the break, we're going to look at the greatest reason why we should believe what Jesus said he was, that is, his claim to be divine, and that is his resurrection. His resurrection, it's important to note, does not prove his divinity, but it definitively vindicates his claims to divinity. Okay? It doesn't prove his divinity because, St. Padre Pio and other saints have risen people from the dead. But his resurrection indeed definitively vindicates the context, the religious context in which he made those claims to be God. That's why the resurrection of Jesus, the literal, historical, bodily resurrection of Jesus, is so important to our faith that St. Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, folks, in other words, paraphrasing here, you might as well pack your bags and go home because we're here for nothing. Our faith is in vain if Jesus did not literally rise from the grave. And so this is why the resurrection is so important. And the apology or the argument for the resurrection of Jesus kind of goes like this. This is the movement. Step 1, there are certain historical facts that must be accounted for. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at 3 essential historical facts: the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the unique expansion and growth of the Christian movement. These are 3 historical facts that we can historically verify in light of the historical method and the criteria of authenticity, etc. We can verify these are historical facts, and they have to be accounted for. Step 2, they're either going to be accounted for by the literal historical bodily resurrection of Jesus or some of the other alternative theories to the literal resurrection of Jesus. Step 3, the alternative theories to the literal resurrection of Jesus cannot account for the historical facts. They cannot hold water in legitimately explaining these historical facts. Therefore, we conclude the literal historical resurrection of Jesus is the most reasonable and plausible explanation for the historical facts, and therefore reasonable and responsible to accept this historical event of Jesus coming out of the grave and rising from the dead. Amen? Okay, so let's dive right in. Let's look at our historical facts. The first historical fact is the empty tomb. And just as a side note here, please note that I'm barely scratching the surface in this brief apology for the resurrection. The various works that I referred to earlier, Dr. William Lane Craig and even Father Spitzer's writings on our website, majacenter.com, goes into much, much more detail in regard to the historical reliability of these facts. In fact, right around Easter time, I may give a 2-hour session just on the resurrection itself and go through the various details just to show you the plethora of evidence that is there to support our belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, so let's look at the empty tomb. There are 5 lines of evidence, you might say. The first of which is Jesus' burial is historically reliable. It's historically reliable that Jesus was buried. Now, why is this significant for the fact of the empty tomb? Well, if I can show that Jesus was historically buried, and that's reasonable to accept, well then, when the authors are starting to talk about the empty tomb and the resurrection, well then, the people present at the time could simply go and check the tomb, right? And undercut the fabricated events by the New Testament authors. So if we can show Jesus was historically buried, well then that would point to the fact of the empty tomb, because they go around saying, the tomb's empty. Jesus is risen from the dead. And so if I know Jesus was buried, well then it would make sense that the empty tomb is indeed a historical fact. So how do we know that Jesus' burial is historically reliable? 2 reasons. Number 1, Jesus' burial is reported in independent early sources. There are 5 independent sources. Scholars point out Mark's source, the source that Mark is pulling from for his gospel narrative, dates all the way to 37 AD. Even just from a historical perspective, we know from our tradition that would have been Peter, right? Peter giving Mark what to write down, so that's an early source right there. Paul mentions the empty tomb implicitly in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, where St. Paul says he was buried and then he was raised from the dead, implying that the tomb was empty. And scholars point out that the source that Paul is drawing from is very, very early indeed. It's actually an early creed. Scholars across the board affirm that 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, in which this statement is found, is an early creed within the Christian church, and thus dates back prior to Paul's writing of 1 Corinthians 15, which dates to around 50 to 52 AD. So that's another independent early source. Remember what we said. The less time span there is between the event and the record of the event, the more historically reliable it is. So that's the first reason. Jesus' burial is reported in independent early sources. We also have Matthew and Luke pulling from their source, which scholars call it the Q source. Matthew and Luke pulling from an original source. And then John's source as well. And then we also have the book of Acts. Acts indicating the empty tomb. So we have 5 independent early sources historically verifying the empty tomb. The second reason why the empty tomb is historical, and I don't have these reasons on the PowerPoint here, so just you can follow along on your handout. Second reason, the burial by Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be an invention. Scholars point out that it does not make sense that the gospel authors would make up a story involving a member of the Sanhedrin and paint him in such a delightful way that he cared for the body of Jesus. I mean, he's a member of the very group that put him to death on the charge of blasphemy. So if they're making this stuff up, they would not paint a member of the Sanhedrin in such a delightful way and saying he cared for the body of Jesus. So in light of these 2 reasons, scholars conclude Jesus' burial is historically reliable. The first piece of evidence for the historical fact of the empty tomb. If he was buried, well then we know that tomb was empty when those early disciples went around saying Jesus is risen from the dead. Because if that tomb was not empty and the body was still there, they could have easily gone and showed the body and say, these dudes, they're frauds, guys. You don't need to believe what they're saying. Second line of evidence for the empty tomb. The discovery of Jesus' empty tomb is independently reported in very early sources. Once again, the discovery of the empty tomb is reported in independent sources. Paul's testimony, once again, guarantees the fact. of the empty tomb. Secondly, Mark's account of the empty tomb is a part of the source material used by Mark and thus is very old. Thirdly, Matthew's account of the empty tomb reveals that he used an independent source. Scholars point out how it's unique. Matthew's account of the discovery of the empty tomb is unique. Number one, he recounts how a gourd was placed at the tomb. And then secondly, the story of the Jews conspiring that the apostles stole the body is unique to Matthew. In light of these two unique details, scholars conclude that Matthew is drawing from an independent source about the discovery of the empty tomb. So Matthew, along with Mark's independent source and Paul's independent source, points to the historical reliability of the discovery of the empty tomb being historically reliable. Fourthly, Luke's account seems to be using an independent source. He talks about how two disciples went to the tomb to verify the women's claim that the tomb was empty. This is not in Mark, thus indicating independent from Mark, and it's not in John, thus John is already coming from an independent source than the synoptics to begin with. So you have all of these independent sources that the New Testament writers are pulling from about the discovery of the empty tomb. John talks about it, but his source is independent from the synoptics. I already mentioned that. And finally, the Acts of the Apostles is an independent source. So, the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb is independently reported in very early sources. So notice, remember how we talked about the criteria of authenticity, right? And we said how two of those criteria were early testimony and multiple attestation. Those two sources, a criteria of authenticity, are present here in regard to the discovery of the empty tomb. So we can check those off and say, hey, the empty tomb, it's reasonable to conclude that's a historical fact. Third reason why the empty tomb is a historical fact, as you see on your handout. Mark's account of it is simple. Now, scholars would say that Mark's account is the earliest, coming from the earliest source. And notice how his account is simple. And it lacks any sort of theological development. So historians are very wary when it comes to high theology within the text of the Gospels. For example, in John, when John recounts how Jesus makes these claims to divinity, it includes a very high theology, and skeptical historians are very wary of that. Now, we as Christians, we know, hey, just because it contains high theology doesn't mean they made it up. Jesus said these things, right? But skeptical historians are wary of theological developments embedded in the text. So when we have Mark as an account of the discovery of the empty tomb, it's very simple. No high theology. There's no dramatic explanation of Jesus rising from the dead in glory and people worshiping him, etc. It's just very simple. Tomb's empty, period. And so even for a skeptical historian, they look at that and they say, wow, that's an indication that the empty tomb is a historical fact. This is historically reliable. Fourthly, the discovery of the empty tomb by women, as I mentioned earlier, points to the historical reliability of the tomb being empty. Why? Because the testimony of women was not valued in the first century in the ancient culture. And so why in the world would the gospel authors tell the story including women testifying, being the first to testify to the empty tomb, if they're making it up? You don't do that. That'd be like shooting yourself in the foot, folks, okay? But the fact that they do indicates that it's because it's true. They discovered an empty tomb. And then finally, the early Jewish propaganda against the Christian believers presupposes the empty tomb. Remember, Matthew tells us that the Jewish leaders conspire and develop the conspiracy theory that the apostles stole the body, right? Why would they need to develop such a conspiracy if the tomb is not empty? Does that make sense? So the propaganda, the Jewish propaganda, implies necessarily that the tomb is empty. They're just offering an alternative explanation to explain the empty tomb an alternative explanation to the literal resurrection of Jesus, which is what the early apostles were going around saying. So in light of these 5 lines of evidence, we can conclude that it is reasonable and responsible, historically speaking, that the tomb of Jesus was empty when the apostles are going around saying he is risen from the dead. That's our first fact. Now, does the empty tomb automatically prove Jesus is risen from the dead? No. There are some alternative theories that could explain the empty tomb as opposed to the literal resurrection of Jesus. We're going to look at those in a few minutes. But that's our first historical fact that we have to account for. The second historical fact is the post-mortem physical or bodily appearances of Jesus to the early Christian disciples. This is historically reliable, verifiable. So, for example, Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene and the women. This is multiply attested to in Mark 16:9, John 20:11 through 18, and Matthew 28:8 through 10. So there we have the multiple attestation, right? Remember that criteria of authenticity? Then also we have that embarrassment criterion of authenticity, right? The embarrassment. Remember we said you don't want to put something that's embarrassing to your cause in the text if you're lying about it or making it up, right? And the fact that they're saying women, once again, women were the first testimonies, first witnesses of the resurrection would indicate that this is historically reliable. These authors of the New Testament Gospels are not making this appearance of Jesus stuff up. They're not lying about it, because they would not be so dumb to put such an embarrassing thing about their story that they're lying about, okay? Secondly, Jesus appeared to Peter himself. Once again, it's multiply attested to by St. Luke in Luke 24:34, as well as St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 5. And remember, Paul got this from first-hand account. Remember Galatians 1:18 through 19, Paul tells us he went up to Jerusalem to visit with Peter, an eyewitness. And so Paul is recounting to us what an eyewitness told him. Hey, Jesus appeared to me personally, by myself. And it's accounted for twofold, Luke and Paul. Thirdly, Jesus appeared to the 12, the distinct 12, the 12 apostles, the intimate group of Jesus, on several different occasions. First of all, immediately after the resurrection. This is multiply attested to by Paul, 1 Corinthians 15:5, Luke 24:36 through 43, and John himself in John 20:19 through 20, verse 20 to 23. Remember, whosoever sins you forgive, they're forgiven. Whosoever sins you retain, they're retained. Okay? And notice, at that particular time, we have some transmaterial characteristics of the body of Jesus. The doors were locked. Poof, there he is, appearing in their midst. Okay? So you have immediately after the resurrection. You also have later on the seashore, according to John 21, and even before the ascension, Matthew 28:19 through 20. And I would recall that a week after Jesus appeared to the original 12, the next Sabbath day, when he appears, there's doubting Thomas, right? And Thomas is doubting, and they believe he's a ghost, and Jesus says, no, look, here, see, I'm not a ghost. I am flesh and blood. Put your hands in the wounds, which would be an indication that Jesus' appearance was a bodily, physical appearance, and that's going to be key in a few moments. So Jesus appeared to the 12 on several different occasions, and it's multiply attested to. That's historically reliable, folks. Fourthly, Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. St. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 6. My dear friends, I don't know about you, but if we were to go into if tomorrow somebody were to ask you, hey, did you go to that Carlo Broussard talk there? And was Carlo Broussard actually there giving the lecture? And you say, yeah, I was there, I saw it. Now that person may be skeptical of your testimony because it's only coming from one person. So that person might go to Kay and say, hey, Kay, were you at the lecture? Was Carlo the one giving the lecture? Right? It wasn't an alien or anything, right? Or some other Cajun from Louisiana maybe who was impersonating Carlo, right? And so Kay says, yeah, I was there. I saw Carlo. Carlo was there. Kay verifies it. Would that person be reasonable and responsible to accept based upon two testimonies that Carlo actually gave the lecture? Yeah. We have maybe 25, 30 people in here this evening. And if that person would ask all 30 of you, was Carlo the one giving the lecture? And you all say yes, well then that person would be literally dumb and irresponsible not to accept the testimony. Folks, St. Paul says 500 people saw Jesus after he was crucified and buried. That is good historical testimony. And folks, Paul would even say, while he's penning the letter, you don't believe it? Go ask him. Because he speaks of how even those who saw the risen Jesus, even some of them are still alive to this day when Paul is penning the letter anywhere from 50 to 52 AD. That is good reason to accept the historical testimony of the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, folks. Another example, fifthly, Jesus appeared to James. Paul tells us this in 1 Corinthians 15:6. Remember, what did Paul say in Galatians 1:18 through 19? Particularly verse 19, when Paul says he went to Jerusalem to visit with Peter. He says, I saw none of the other apostles except James, the brother of the Lord. Okay? So Paul would have conversed with James as well, and thus getting first-hand account that he witnessed the risen Jesus, that Jesus appeared to him individually. Not only Peter, but James as well. Another reason, Jesus appeared to all the apostles, St. Paul tells us, as well as others. Now, all the apostles in St. Paul's account, in 1 Corinthians 15:6, this would refer to sort of a broader group beyond the 12. Okay, because he already referred to the 12. Now he's saying all the apostles. Many scholars will conclude that this seems to refer to sort of the broader group on the day of Pentecost, right? The 120 brethren that were together, either in the upper room or at the temple, however you take that on the day of Pentecost. But the point is, this is multiply attested to. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:7, Luke in Luke 24:50 through 51, it's a distinct, separate appearance of Jesus to a broader group beyond the 12. And then in Acts 1, verses 2 and 6 through 11, before Jesus ascends into heaven, and he says, you will be my martyroi to the ends of the earth. Remember that text? Jesus is appearing there to the broader group of disciples beyond the original 12. So we have three sources testifying to the fact that Jesus not only appeared to the 12, but he appeared to a broader group. And then finally, Jesus appeared to Paul. Paul tells us himself in 1 Corinthians 15:8, and I think he's pretty sincere about it because he would die for it, right? And then it's also recounted by St. Luke in Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26. Luke is telling us how Paul was converted. Luke actually records the words of Paul when he's talking about his experience of the risen Jesus, etc. So we have all of these post-mortem appearances that are historically reliable and verifiable. And I would refer you to Dr. William Lane Craig's book, The Risen Son, Historical Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus. And what he does is he takes each and one of these appearances and shows how at least one of the signs of historical reliability or criteria of authenticity apply to these appearances, and thus reasonable to conclude they're historical facts. Good so far? So we got our empty tomb. We have our post-mortem appearances. These are historically reliable. And then finally, we have the expansion, the unique, I might add. Sorry about the PowerPoint. I'm losing track here. The unique expansion and growth of the Christian movement. This is an important historical fact. Number one, development number one. Notice that the apostles didn't choose another leader after Jesus was crucified, but they continue looking to him as their leader. Don't you think that if your leader gets killed by the very enemy you were hoping he would set you free from, don't you think you would get another leader? I mean, your leader kind of failed, don't you think? But yet they did not. They continued looking to Jesus as their leader. Second development, the apostles continued to assert that Jesus was Lord and Messiah, despite the fact that he was crucified and buried, folks. Why in the world would individuals, would these disciples go around saying, Jesus is God, He is Messiah, worship Him, when He's buried in the tomb and He was crucified, once again by the very enemy you were hoping He would set you free from? That does not make sense. There has to be something to account for this unique development of the Christian movement, continuing to say He is Lord, God, and Messiah, despite the fact He was murdered and buried. And finally, the third unique development, the Christian movement, my dear friends, succeeded in taking over the whole Roman Empire, despite the persecutions. The very authority and power that murdered their leader, the very power and authority that was murdering the Christians in the first century and torturing them and persecuting them, that very authority, that very empire, that kingdom was taken over by the Christian movement. And it would become a Christian empire under Theodosius I, I think around 400 AD, right? Isn't that amazing? So these are three unique developments of the Christian movement that have to be accounted for. So we have our three facts. What's the best reasonable, plausible explanation for the three facts? It's either going to be the literal historical resurrection of Jesus, the bodily resurrection of Jesus that the early apostles were proclaiming, or it's going to be some alternative theory. Do the alternative theories reasonably and plausibly account for the three historical facts? Well, my dear friends, the answer is no. And I think I have 5 alternative theories here that I'm going to share with you tonight. The first of which is called the conspiracy theory. Very common. The apostles stole the body, and they lied about the post-mortem appearances. So notice how it would account for the empty tomb, right? It accounts for the empty tomb, and it could even account for the post-mortem appearances. But are there reasons why we should believe? Are there reasons why we should deny this conspiracy theory? Now, side note, as Dr. William Lane Craig and many other scholars point out, the majority of scholars reject this theory. That is, on the scholarly level. This theory still lives today, but it's more so on the popular level. Like the person you encounter on the street, or the person on YouTube or the internet or something that has no credentials of scholarship whatsoever. But the historians and the scholars even reject this theory. But because it's still prevalent today, we still need to respond to it. 8 answers to the conspiracy theory. Number 1, the disciples died for the resurrection of Jesus, thus proving their sincerity. Now remember, that doesn't prove that it literally happened. It just proves their sincerity. They can't be lying about this stuff. Right? People don't die for what they know to be a lie. Secondly, the disciples, as you see there on your handout here, the disciples had no reasonable motive for a lie. Very similar to when we spoke of Jesus dying for His claims to divinity. No reasonable motives for lying. They had everything to lose and nothing to gain. And when that is the case, that's the best witness you can have on the witness stand. Everything to lose, nothing to gain. What did they have to lose? Well, first of all, if they still believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of their fathers, they're risking damnation in lying about the resurrection of Jesus. And secondly, if they don't believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob anymore, well then they have nothing to gain except death from lying about the resurrection of Jesus. Because think about it. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, folks, and they're lying about it, will they rise from the dead too? No. So what is their end? The grave. And so all they have to gain from lying about the resurrection of Jesus is the grave. They have nothing to gain. My dear friends, there is no return on the investment in that case. Thirdly, the conspiracy never unraveled, even under the pain of torture. There is no historical documentation of any Christian slipping up under the pain of torture and saying, it's all a lie! But they all go to death for it, proving their sincerity. Fourthly, the Gospels were written within temporal and geographical proximity of the events. If they were lying about this stuff, well then those who witnessed Jesus and were around Jesus, etc., they could have disproven the fabricated events. They could have proven, nope, these guys are lying. Look, the body's still in the tomb. These guys are lying. Jesus never, hey, Matthew could have come and said, John's making this stuff up. Or some other disciple who was intimate with the apostles could have come around and said, they're making this stuff up. They're not telling the truth. Jesus never appeared to those guys. Don't believe them. Fifthly, the apostles had a drastic transformation from doubt to faith. They even acknowledged themselves they didn't believe. They were grief-stricken by the crucifixion of Jesus. They doubted Jesus. Boo-hoo-hoo! We thought he was the Messiah. He's dead! Right? But all of a sudden, they go and get their heads chopped off for him. All of a sudden, they go and they get their limbs pulled off and their flesh flogged and ripped off their body for him, for that dead Messiah. Notice the transformation from doubt to bold proclamation of Jesus in faith, the conviction of faith, right? My dear friends, the lie of the resurrection cannot reasonably explain that transformation. Another reason why the lie or conspiracy theory does not hold water, women were described to be the first witnesses of the resurrection. Once again, boy, that little detail serves a lot of purposes, doesn't it? It shows us that they could not have been lying, because that's one of those criteria of authenticity, embarrassment, right? If you're trying to lie about this story, my dear friends, it would be shooting yourself in the foot, pulling the rug out from underneath your own feet if you're going to include this detail in your fabricated story. Nobody will take it serious if you're lying about this stuff. The only reason why they put it is because it's true. Another reason, the fact that the Gospels even mention the conspiracy idea. Why would Matthew even mention it and even give his audience the opportunity to even think of a conspiracy theory? As Father Spitzer says, it is apologetically non-beneficial. It is not beneficial apologetically speaking. You're trying to make a defense for this, right? If you're trying to prove to someone Jesus is risen from the dead, you don't shoot yourself in the foot. You don't give the opportunity for your audience to even doubt what you're trying to prove. But Matthew does that. He points out the conspiracy theory developed by the Jewish Sanhedrin. Why? Because it's true. That's what they did. And finally, the conspiracy theory, although it may account for the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearances, namely they're lying about it, it does not account for the unique expansion and growth of the Christian movement. My dear friends, we're dealing with hard-nosed Romans and the Roman Empire. They would have squashed out a lie in a heartbeat. The lie would have come to the surface, and the Christian movement would have been, as we say in Louisiana, c'est tout finisha, done. Over with. So the conspiracy theory simply does not hold water in explaining an alternative hypothesis to the literal resurrection of Jesus to account for the historical facts. It simply does not work. And as I mentioned, the majority of scholars reject it. And we move on to another theory, an alternative to the literal resurrection of Jesus. Well, maybe we can explain the empty tomb because maybe some people robbed the body of Jesus. Jesus' body was robbed, and the apostles, upon discovering the empty tomb, simply inferred he's risen from the dead. See? Once again, not held by scholars, but on more of a popular level, so thus it merits a response. 4 answers. Number 1, no proof of the theory. It's totally hypothetical, right? You go around saying, Carlo wasn't at the lecture giving the lecture, it was an alien from Mars. Right? You can make anything you want up. Just as this is made up. There's no proof for the theory, right? Secondly, the theory would have to prove that the placement of the gourd at the tomb, recounted by Matthew, is a fabrication and is a lie. So it would have to, once again, notice what it has to do. This theory, grave robbery, inference of resurrection, it would have to pull on the conspiracy theory as well. Which scholars, when you have to take different theories and put them together to account for something, scholars reject that and say that is not plausible. The most simplest explanation is the one that's more preferred, okay? Because having to make these different assumptions, it violates Occam's razor, which is a principle of simplicity. The one with the least amount of assumptions is the better explanation. So this theory, the grave robbery theory, would have to pull from the conspiracy theory as well, which mitigates its plausibility. Number 3, grave robbers don't rob bodies, folks. They rob the linens. Okay? So this grave robbery theory simply does not hold water. Grave robbery was very common in the ancient world. And they would take the linens because the linens were worth something. They were valuable. They would leave the body. They ain't worth nothing. So why would they take the body of Jesus? Doesn't make sense. Fourthly, as I mentioned, grave robberies were very common in the ancient world in the first century. So why would the apostles, if that's something that happens all the time, why would the apostles infer this bodily, literal, transmaterial resurrection of Jesus in glory? Why would they infer that based upon an empty tomb if they're thinking somebody stole the body? They robbed the grave. That's a common occurrence. Thus, it would not lead them to make their conclusions about the resurrection of Jesus. So the grave robbery theory simply does not explain legitimately the 3 historical facts, and there are plausible reasons that mitigate against that theory. Third alternative theory to the literal resurrection of Jesus, and it's called the swoon theory. And that is to say, Christ never died. This asserts that Jesus fell unconscious, which is what the word swooned refers to. He was swooned. He fell unconscious and was simply resuscitated and then came back to life in the grave. So he was brutally tortured. Seemingly he died on the cross, but he just fell unconscious, and when they buried him in the grave, as I would say, the cool air of the tomb revived him. Right? And he sort of resuscitated, came back to consciousness and was able to get out the tomb. 6 answers to blow this theory out the water. Number 1, Jesus could not have survived a Roman crucifixion, my friends. Okay? They were trained killers. They knew how to do their job and do it well. As Wolverine would say, I'm the best at what I do. Anyway, you wouldn't know that, maybe? I don't know. David, you know. Okay, excuse me. Secondly, I'm sorry, folks. I had to say that, okay? Got to have a little fun every now and then, right? The Roman soldier didn't break Jesus' legs. Remember that? John tells us in John 19:31-33. Why didn't the soldier break Jesus' legs? Because he was already dead. He didn't need to break the legs of Jesus. He had to do so for the other 2, the thieves. But he didn't do so for Jesus because he concluded he was already dead. Thirdly, John tells us in that very same text that blood and water flowed from his side, which many will tell us that indicates death by asphyxiation, which is the collapse of the lungs. Fourthly, Jesus' post-mortem appearances convinced doubting apostles. Right? Remember that. These apostles were scared. They were doubting. They were grief-stricken by the death of Jesus. And all of a sudden they see Jesus and they're ready to go be killed for him and proclaim the gospel message and be the martyrs to the ends of the earth. How is a half-dead man going to convince these doubting apostles to become martyrs for him? I mean, imagine that. You know, we're all terrified in the upper room, and then all of a sudden Jesus comes walking in and he's just, all flesh, no flesh and bloody and half dead. And I don't know about you, but that is not going to convince me to go around saying Jesus is God, Jesus is Messiah, and giving up my life for it. It doesn't make sense. Fifthly, the Roman soldiers were placed to guard the tomb. Remember that? How could Jesus, half dead, overcome the guards placed there and make it to the apostles in the upper room to appear to them? It doesn't make sense. Finally, Jesus was enclosed in a tomb with a heavy stone. How could the half-dead Jesus coming to consciousness have enough strength after being tortured by the Roman soldiers to move away the heavy stone that is enclosing the tomb? So we can see how the swoon theory simply does not make sense when you think about it. So this alternative to the literal resurrection of Jesus falls short. We come to the fourth alternative, and that is a common one. The disciples hallucinated, also known as the hallucination theory. And hallucination is, as you know, a projection of the mind onto the outer world. So maybe these apostles, and this is an attempt to explain the post-mortem appearances, right? As we're going to see, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. It just tries to explain the post-mortem appearances. That is, they projected onto the world. They thought they hallucinated seeing Jesus. How do we answer this? Number one, the New Testament portrays Jesus risen in a corporeal form, bodily risen from the dead. Not just some sort of ghost or vision or hallucination, but he was risen in his body. Number one, Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 15, we know Jesus rose bodily because Paul uses Jesus' resurrection as the foundation for talking about our resurrection in the future. When St. Paul talks about our bodily resurrection at the end of time, he's basing it on the resurrection of Jesus, which would indicate that he must believe that Jesus rose bodily as well. Okay? So Paul implies that Jesus' resurrection was a bodily appearance, not merely a hallucination, but also the Gospels themselves. Every time when the Gospel writers portray the risen Jesus, it is always in corporeal form. It is always in bodily form. Recall? Jesus said, I am not a ghost. They thought he was a ghost or a spirit. And so he says, look, here, feel my flesh. Okay? Hallucinations don't have flesh, folks. Hallucinations don't eat fish on the seashore with the apostles like it is indicated in John 21. Hallucinations don't say, here, touch. All right? Okay? So we see there is evidence for the bodily appearances of Jesus, which militates against the hallucination theory. Secondly, many scholars point out the number and various circumstances of the appearances make hallucinations an improbable explanation. I mean, Jesus is appearing to not just one person, right? But a multitude of individuals, 500 plus, and in all various different circumstances in various different locations. The hallucination theory simply cannot explain the number of appearances and the various circumstances of the appearances. And finally, as many point out, which is very probative in force, the new aspects of Jesus' bodily appearances make the hallucination theory implausible. And when I speak of the new aspects of Jesus' appearances, that which is new in comparison to the common Jewish belief about the resurrection. I'm going to share with you just 3 unique aspects. Number 1, as you see on your handout, Christians believed in a transmaterial, corporeal state of resurrection for Jesus. Transmaterial, that is a body, yes, but a body that could walk through walls, and a body that could have the gift of agility and be in one spatial location and the next at the speed of thought, not having to walk through space. Okay? And even there's indications of Jesus appearing in a glorified form, taking on different bodily appearances, right? Mary Magdalene thought he was the gardener. The apostles on the mountain in Matthew 28, they doubted whether it was Jesus. When they were in John 21 on the seashore, some doubted whether to ask him if he was the Lord. There's indications that Jesus would have appeared to them in a glorified state as well, like in the Transfiguration, and thus leaving the apostles to know, is this Yahweh? Is this God? Or is this Jesus? Etc. That's totally foreign to the common Jewish belief of the resurrection. The Jews believed at the time, Second Temple Judaism, believed in a resurrection, indeed. But it was simply sort of like the resurrection of Lazarus, right? Coming back to this life in the body, but not in this sort of glorified state or transmaterial state. That's a unique aspect of Jesus' resurrection. Now remember, hallucinations are a projection of the mind onto the world. Therefore, hallucinations can never, as scholars point out, can never go beyond the content of the mind. But the apostles, in talking about the appearances of Jesus, they're describing it in ways that are totally foreign to what have been in their Jewish minds. in light of the Jewish theological environment. Second unique aspect, and I'm going to start wrapping it up here, won't take me much longer. The idea of someone rising from the dead before the general resurrection at the end of time is unique, foreign from Second Temple Judaism. The Jews believed in the resurrection, but all would rise at the end of time, just like we believe as Christians. But for one single individual to precede that general resurrection is extremely unique and foreign to the Jewish milieu within the theological environment. Third unique aspect. Notice how within Christianity the doctrine of the resurrection becomes a central doctrine, becomes the heart of the Christian movement and the Christian message. That's something that's foreign to Second Temple Judaism and the Jewish environment within theology. They believed in the resurrection, but it wasn't a central doctrine. Something on the outskirts, you might say, taking a back seat. But for Christians, it was driving the car, folks. Okay? That's a unique aspect. So, in light of these new aspects of the resurrection of Jesus, these appearances cannot be a projection of the content in their mind onto the outer world. It goes way beyond what is in their minds as Jews. And further, remember these unique aspects, because some will say, oh, well, the apostles started developing this resurrection of Jesus, and maybe they hallucinated or had a vision of Jesus, but they sort of talked about the bodily resurrection of Jesus in light of their Jewish background, because the Jews believed in a bodily resurrection. So that might be the explanation of why they sort of developed this resurrection idea of Jesus. Folks, that cannot be the case because of the new aspects, what we call the mutations, the Christian mutations about the doctrine of the resurrection. Finally, we come to the last alternative theory, and that is the vision theory, technically called parapsychological phenomena. That is to say, the apostles, maybe they're not hallucinating. Okay, it's because hallucinations are a projection of the mind onto the outer world. There's nothing objectively there, right? The vision theory says, well, maybe there's something objectively there in the outer world. It's just not the literal bodily Jesus, the corporeal Jesus. It's just a vision of Jesus. Very much like you and I might have a vision of someone or Jesus or of Mary, or somebody else might have a vision of a saint, etc. Maybe it's a vision, right? How do we answer this? 4 ways we can answer. The vision theory cannot explain the historically reliable fact of the bodily appearances, the bodily post-mortem appearances of Jesus. The early church was very emphatic that Jesus appeared bodily. Paul and the gospel writers themselves, okay? So that fact militates against the vision theory. Secondly, the visions cannot explain the unique aspects of Jesus' resurrection once again. Those unique developments from Second Temple Judaism to the Christian doctrine of resurrection cannot be explained by the vision theory. Okay? Thirdly, it does not account for the empty tomb. If it's just a vision, well then the body must still be in the empty tomb, right? So let's go take the body out and prove these guys wrong. So we see it lacking an explanation of the historical fact of the empty tomb. And finally, the number of occasions of Jesus' appearances make the vision theory unlikely. Many scholars have pointed out in my research that visions, like vision of dead people, often happen at the moment of their death, or shortly thereafter. After they die, very shortly, there's a vision, etc. But notice how, and it just happens one time and it's done and over with, right? But notice how Jesus' appearance take place on a number of different occasions and a number of different circumstances. That historical fact militates against the vision theory. Now, are there more alternatives? Yes, there are a few more. And in the resources that I referred you to, they deal with all of these theories. I have given you some of the most 5 common alternative theories to the literal historical resurrection of Jesus. These are the most common, and as you can see, they do not hold water as a plausible explanation of the three historical facts: that the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth was empty, that his early disciples literally saw him in bodily, corporeal form, and even a glorified state, having some cool properties, right? And then thirdly, the unique development and growth of the Christian movement. The most simplest explanation that seems to be the most plausible and reasonable to hold to is the literal resurrection of Jesus. So in simple syllogism form, premise number one, the historical facts are due to one of the following: either the literal resurrection of Jesus or the alternative theories. Premise two, the alternative theories do not hold water in accounting for the historical facts. Therefore, the literal historical bodily resurrection of Jesus is the only plausible and reasonable explanation for these historical facts. And therefore, my dear friends, we can conclude from a historical perspective, it is reasonable to accept that this historical man, Jesus of Nazareth, who claimed to be God, rose from the grave. Amen? And that resurrection from the grave vindicates his claims to divinity. Therefore, I come to the doorstep of faith. Reason has led me through the historical investigation of what this man said and what he did to verify what he said. And now, our blessed Lord extends the invitation in saying, will you come and follow me, right? Will you accept me? Will you acknowledge me before men? Because if you do, I will acknowledge you before my Father. And that's where we make the act of faith to give our lives over to Jesus and submitting to him in faith, in love, and saying, I am yours.